Section 9 of the Critique of Practical Reason by Immanuel Kant, translated by Thomas Kingsmill Abbott. First Part. Elements of Pure Practical Reason, Book 1, The Analytic of Pure Practical Reason, Chapter 3, of the Motives of Pure Practical Reason. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie van Mallegem. What is essential in the moral worth of actions is that a moral law should directly determine the will. If the determination of the will takes place in conformity indeed to the moral law, but only by means of a feeling, no matter of what kind, which has to be presupposed in order that the law may be sufficient to determine the will, and therefore not for the sake of the law, then the action will possess legality, but not morality. Now, if we understand by motive, illeter animi, the subjective ground of determination of the will of a being whose reason does not necessarily conform to the objective law by virtue of its own nature, then it will follow, first, that not motives can be attributed to the divine will, and that the motives of the human will, as well as that of every created rational being, can never be anything else than the moral law, and consequently that the objective principle of determination must always and alone be also the subjectively sufficient determining principle of the action, if this is not merely to fulfil the letter of the law without containing its spirit. We may say of every action that conforms to the law but is not done for the sake of the law, that it is morally good in the letter, not in the spirit, the intention. Since then, for the purpose of giving the moral law influence over the will, we must not seek for any other motives that might enable us to dispense with the motive of the law itself, because that would produce mere hypocrisy without consistency, and it is even dangerous to allow other motives, for instance that of interest, even to co-operate along with the moral law. Hence nothing is left us but to determine carefully in what way the moral law becomes motive, and what effect this has upon the faculty of desire. For as to the question how a law can be directly and of itself a determining principle of the will, which is the essence of morality, this is, for human reason, an insoluble problem, and identical with the question how a free will is possible. Therefore, what we have to show a priori is not why the moral law in itself supplies a motive, but what effect it, as such, produces, or, more correctly speaking, must produce on the mind. The essential point in every determination of the will by the moral law is that being a free will it is determined simply by the moral law, not only without the co-operation of sensible impulses, but even to the reaction of all such, and to the checking of all inclinations, so far as they might be opposed to that law. So far, then, the effect of the moral law as a motive is only negative, and this motive can be known a priori to be such. For all inclination and every sensible impulse is founded on feeling, and the negative effect produced on feeling, by the check on the inclinations, is itself feeling. Consequently, we can see a priori that a moral law as a determining principle of the will must, by thwarting all our inclinations, produce a feeling which may be called pain, and in this we have the first, perhaps the only instance in which we are able from a priori considerations to determine the relation of a cognition, in this case of pure practical reason, to the feeling of pleasure or displeasure. All the inclinations together, which can be reduced to a tolerable system, in which case this satisfaction is called happiness, constitute self-regard, solipsismus. This is either the self-love that consists in an excessive fondness for oneself, philosia, or satisfaction with oneself, arrogantia. The former is called particularly selfishness, the latter self-conceit. Pure practical reason only checks selfishness, looking on it as natural and active in us even prior to the moral law, so far as to limit it to the condition of agreement with this law, and then it is called rational self-love. But self-conceit, reason strikes down altogether, since all claims to self-esteem which precede agreement with the moral law are vain and unjustifiable. For the certainty of a state of mind that coincides with this law is a first condition of personal worth, as we shall presently show more clearly, and prior to this conformity any pretensions to worth is false and unlawful. Now, the propensity to self-esteem is one of the inclinations which the moral law checks, inasmuch as that esteem rests only on morality. Therefore, the moral law breaks down self-conceit. But as this law is something positive in itself, namely, the form of an intellectual casualty, that is of freedom, it must be an object of respect. For by opposing this subjective antagonism of the inclinations, it weakens self-conceit, and since it even breaks down, that is, humiliates, this conceit, it is an object of the highest respect, and consequently is the foundation of a positive feeling which is not of empirical origin, but is known a priori. Therefore, respect for the moral law is a feeling which is produced by an intellectual cause, and this feeling is the only one that we know quite a priori, and the necessity of which we can perceive. In the preceding chapter we have seen that everything that presents itself as an object of the will prior to the moral law is by that law itself, which is a supreme condition of practical reason, excluded from the determining principles of the will which we have called the unconditionally good, and that a mere practical form, which consists in the adaptation of the maxims to universal legislation, first determines what is good in itself and absolutely, and is the basis of the maxims of a pure will, which alone is good in every respect. However, we find that our nature as sensible beings is such that the matter of desire, objects of inclination, whether of hope or fear, first presents itself to us, and our pathologically affected self, although it is in its maxims quite unfit for universal legislation, yet just as if it constituted our entire self, strives to put its pretensions forward first, and to have them acknowledged as the first and original. This propensity to make ourselves in the subjective determining principles of our choice serve as the objective determining principle of the will generally may be called self-love, and if this pretends to be legislative as an unconditional practical principle, it may be called self-conceit. Now the moral law, which alone is truly objective, namely in every respect, entirely excludes the influence of self-love on the supreme practical principle, and indefinitely checks the self-conceit that prescribes the subjective conditions of the former as laws. Now whatever checks our self-conceit in our judgment humiliates, therefore the moral law inevitably humbles every man when he compares with it the physical propensities of his nature. That, the idea of which as a determining principle of our will humbles us in our self-consciousness, awakes respect for itself, so far as it is itself positive and a determining principle. Therefore the moral law is even subjectively a cause of respect. Now since everything that enters into self-love belongs to inclination, and all inclination rests on feelings, and consequently whatever checks all the feelings together in self-love has necessarily, by this very circumstance, an influence on feeling. Hence we comprehend how it is possible to perceive a priori that a moral law can produce an effect on feeling, and that it excludes the inclinations and the propensity to make them the supreme practical condition, i.e., self-love, from all participation in the supreme legislation. This effect is on one side merely negative, but on the other side, relatively to the restricting principle of pure practical reason, it is positive. No special kind of feeling need be assumed for this under the name of a practical or moral feeling as antecedent to the moral law and serving as its foundation. The negative effect on feeling, unpleasantness, is pathological, like every influence on feeling, and like every feeling generally, but as an effect of the consciousness of the moral law, and consequently in relation to a supersensible cause, namely, the subject of pure practical reason, which is the